Welcome to The Explainer. Have you ever seen a massive rumor completely rewrite reality? Well, today, we're unpacking how a devastating military defeat was spun into literally one of history's most dangerous conspiracy theories. It's a story of how facts were actively suppressed, how a nation's collective trauma was manipulated, and how denying reality set the stage for a completely catastrophic future. Okay, let's put on our historian hats and dive right into this massive historical mystery. How exactly does a country fundamentally deny its own reality on the battlefield? See, when World War I ended in 1918, Germany had lost, period. Yet, a huge chunk of the German public became absolutely convinced that their army was undefeated in the field and had instead been sabotaged from within. So, how does a lie that big actually take hold?
Part 1. The Reality of 1918.
To understand the lie, we've got to establish the brutal facts on the ground. There was a massive gap between the story that right-wing nationalist groups were peddling and the harsh historical reality. The myth claimed the military was completely unbroken but was stabbed in the back by a treacherous civilian population. But the reality? The German military was utterly exhausted by late 1918. Their reserves were totally depleted, and they were simply overwhelmed by Allied forces, especially after the United States entered the conflict.
Think about this timeline. It's basically a devastating domino effect. In September 1918, Bulgaria surrenders. In October, the Ottoman Empire capitulates. By early November, Austria-Hungary is out, which actually left Germany's southern border completely exposed to an Allied invasion. With literally no allies left, the Kaiser abdicates and the armistice is signed. Germany wasn't betrayed, they were just out of time and out of friends.
So despite all those claims of the army being undefeated, we have to remember the German war machine had completely broken down. They were in full retreat on the Western Front. Plus, that looming threat of an Allied invasion from the south through Austria was terrifying. Combine all of that with an Allied naval blockade that was literally starving the civilian population back home, and you have a clear recipe for inevitable defeat. Part 2. A comforting lie. Now, if the defeat was so obvious to the military high command, why was this myth so deeply comforting? Well, it reveals a massive psychological vulnerability within the German officer corps. As historian Robert Citino points out here, the end of World War I was a searing trauma. These officers basically needed the stab-in-the-back myth to preserve their pride. They repeated the lie so often they actually believed it, which led to a really dangerous promise. In the next war, they would never surrender, fighting on to 10 minutes past midnight.
And this mindset wasn't just at the top. Nearly 1/5 of the entire post-war German population were military veterans. 1 in 5. Imagine returning from the absolute horrors of the front lines to a country that, geographically, was still intact. For millions of these guys, accepting that their immense suffering ended in military failure was just unthinkable. They desperately needed a scapegoat to make the bitter pill of defeat easier to swallow.
This disconnect between the front lines and the home front is absolutely crucial to understand. The troops at the front couldn't see the intense suffering happening at home. All they saw was that no Allied troops had crossed onto German soil, so in their minds, they were still holding the line. Meanwhile, civilians are starving from the British blockade, naval sailors are mutinying, and workers are striking just to survive. Because the soldiers were blind to that domestic collapse, it was incredibly easy for them to buy into the idea that the civilians had simply given up and betrayed them.
But here's the thing. This myth didn't just grow organically, it was engineered. The Supreme Commanders, General Erich Ludendorff and Field Marshal Paul von Hindenburg, fully realized the war was lost by late 1918. But to protect their own reputations, they deliberately forced a quick transition to a civilian government. They specifically made the new civilian politicians sign the armistice. Then, in 1919, Hindenburg publicly testified that the army had been stabbed in the back. They literally set up the civilians to take the fall.
Part 3. Fueling the Betrayal.
So the myth is out there, but it needed a powerful catalyst to truly ignite into radical nationalism. And that arrived in the form of a heavily punitive peace treaty. The Treaty of Versailles placed this devastating economic and psychological weight on the German public. It imposed massive, crippling reparations on a country that was already broken by war. That intense financial suffering made the public desperate for someone to blame, making the whole stab-in-the-back idea feel incredibly real to them.
The harsh terms of the treaty basically wrote the propaganda for extremist groups.
Germany was forced to accept full responsibility for the war under the Article 231 War Guilt Clause. They lost 13% of their European territory, all their colonies, and their military was stripped down to just 100,000 men with no air force or tanks. To anyone who believed the myth, this humiliating treaty validated their entire narrative. It turned the Weimar Republic's civilian leaders who signed it into the despised November criminals.
Part 4. The Will to Fight.
Let's look at how this comforting lie was weaponized by extremist groups, particularly the rising Nazi Party, to completely reshape German society. When you put the myths side by side with historical data, you see exactly how facts were twisted to target specific political and ethnic groups. Extremists claimed politicians betrayed the army. Well, reality shows the military forced them to sue for peace. They claimed the home front lacked patriotism. Reality shows they were starving to death. And, incredibly dangerously, the myth claimed Jewish citizens shirked their duty, which was a complete fabrication.
To really understand how deep this fabrication went, we have to talk about the Judenzählung, or the Jewish census of 1916. This is wild. The military ordered this census specifically hoping to prove that Jewish citizens were evading military service, but it backfired completely. The results proved Jewish Germans were serving on the front lines entirely in proportion to their population. And because the facts didn't fit their prejudice, the army just actively suppressed the data, kept it totally hidden.
Adolf Hitler expertly manipulated this psychological trauma. He latched onto the stab-in-the-back myth and connected the 1918 defeat entirely to a lack of national will or mental fortitude. He argued, it wasn't the enemy armies that beat Germany, it was Marxists and Jews who had crippled Germany's iron will from the inside. By promising to restore that national pride and demanding absolute loyalty, he convinced millions that his brand of radical nationalism was the only way to prevent another betrayal.
Part 5. The Cost of a Myth.
Ultimately, we have to look at the world-altering consequences of choosing fiction over reality. This wasn't just some harmless coping mechanism for a defeated army. The stab-in-the-back myth was a lethal propaganda tool. It entirely delegitimized the fragile Weimar democracy right from day one. It justified horrific political violence in the streets, provided the exact blueprint for Nazi propaganda, rallied public support for remilitarization, and ultimately led directly to the outbreak of the Second World War.
I'll leave you with this provocative thought to consider. History shows us pretty clearly that when a nation refuses to face the hard truth of its own failures, it leaves a dangerous void. A void that is almost always filled by those looking to place blame and seize power. Keep questioning the narratives you hear, today and always. Thanks for joining me for this explainer.